Hey there, my friends, and a warm welcome into another episode of the Winsome Creationist podcast. We are slowly but surely making our way through editing the Winsome Creationist book. I can't wait for that. I'm so excited to bring that to you and share that with you. It's been a labor of love, and I'm getting ready to have some great conversations um, with some folks about the book, as well as there's going to be some conversations coming up here soon on the YouTube channel here and in the podcast that I think you guys are going to be really excited about, and maybe get to display a little bit of this winsome approach to creationism with some people who disagree with our view. And that's something that I'm excited about, not in a debating type of way. You guys know I don't really care for debates and that whole scene, because I think there's too much gamesmanship involved. But just the idea of getting to put what we do into practice and sort of demonstrate a little bit of that, I think is very exciting and something that we're looking forward to. Today on the podcast, I want to talk about something that I don't think it will take us long to talk about, and yet it's very important. And it comes from chapter 3 of the book, from a section in the book on what it actually means to be winsome. Okay. Again, what I'm going to do is sort of make a logical progression where the young earth creationism that everyone is familiar with is sort of the YEC trademark, the big YEC, right? That most are familiar with. For me, I got interested in young earth creationism and really took up with it when the new creationism was sort of coming onto the scene for the first time. And so many of my friends are affiliated with that movement that many would call the new creationism. And so I am proposing the next sort of a offshoot of the new creationism, perhaps, that we might call winsome creationism. And winsome creationism is a lot less about what we're doing and the methodologies around it scientifically, and way more about the communication angle of things and just getting back to the basics of the fruits of the spirit. And it's a weird thing to even have to talk about. These are the kind of things that should be handled in independent church, in our own local church congregations and things of that nature. And yet I find this particular corner of what we might call evangelicalism, this strange, combative attitude that is what many young earth creationists are known for. It's such a big issue that that I named my podcast and naming my book, after what I hope to be an antidote. So what I want to give you today is essentially what I call the 3 pillars of winsome creationism. Okay. So what does it mean to be winsome? The word winsome means to be attractive or appealing in appearance or character. And of course, the context here is character. I don't think anybody looks at me and thinks, oh, well, he's winsomely attractive in his appearance. But hopefully you will think that I am in my character. Now, you may disagree with me on things, and you certainly will, but hopefully you at least see that I'm making an effort to reach across an aisle and be gracious and to be friends with everybody. And when I think about this idea of being winsome, and specifically about being attractive, which we're going to get to more in a minute, the overarching concept, the way that I like to think about this, is to be someone that people want to move toward. Right? Think about it. Attractive, right? So if the word winsome means to be attractive in some way, what does that word attractive means? Attractive means is that people move toward you. We move towards attractive people. And so that should be at least one of our goals. And so I do think it's sad, sort of the general perception that people have of creationists, but I don't think it's terminal. I think we can change this. And in fact, I think we've already seen the tide shift in some important ways on these issues. And so I'm excited to continue down that path and hopefully bring you guys with me. One example of somebody that we can look at and we can point to and say, you know what, that is a winsome creationist. Like if you as the writer of the book, as the the guy behind this podcast, if you were to say, Steve will allow for you to pick a guy out of the crowd as our exemplar and say that guy is a winsome creationist, who you gonna pick? And I'll tell you exactly who I'd pick. It's Marcus Ross, Dr. Marcus Ross, a paleontologist and also the founder and owner of Cornerstone Educational Supply. He's been on the podcast before, and he didn't pay me to say this, I promise. I love Dr. Ross. We don't talk as much as I wish we did. I need to have him on more often. That's my fault. I have a very busy schedule. It's way easier to record solo episodes than it is to record interview episodes, especially in this season of my life. So I'm working on it. But Dr. Ross, if I could just point to anybody, is just such a great example of winsomeness. And here's a metric for you. If you search for Dr. Marcus Ross and you just go watch YouTube videos where he's debating someone or he's featured or he's, in a conversation with someone, both sides have nothing but good to say in most cases. And that's in the YouTube comments. Now, I don't know about, how much time you guys spend perusing the YouTube comments, but man, YouTube comments are a tough place. I mean, they're tough to manage. I mean, I'll go sometimes just because I don't have the physical time. I'll go weeks without, being able to meaningfully interact inside of my comments because it just takes so much time to actually go through them, and especially if you're going to do a meaningful response. And there's a lot of hate, frankly, just a lot of hate in YouTube comments. Boy, on Dr. Marcus Ross's videos, though, or any video that he's involved in, man, the comments are usually so positive, so grateful for who he is. And again, this comes from both sides, both the evolutionists and the creationists, though they may agree or disagree at various points. Love him. What I particularly like about Dr. Ross is his ability to be incisive and yet gracious. And there's somebody else who had that ability, and we're going to talk about them here in just a minute. But this ability of being, standing up for what you believe in, being incisive, okay, being knowledgeable, being smart, and maneuvering in conversations well. Dr. Ross really just covers that ground, and he's also just so knowledgeable on the topic, right? He is I think, worthy debate partner for just about anyone on most issues related to creationism. Okay, so if I were to take a look at this and package it all together, the Bible says a three-chord strand, or a three-stranded cord, rather, is not easily broken. What would those three strands of winsome creationism be? If you could tie those things together, I think a winsome creationist would just be a force for our movement if they could come to a table with these three things. And I want you to think about these three and think about how many creationists you know who truly exemplify all three of these characteristics. Now, I'm just going to make a prediction that the number is very small. And I'm trying to be objective about this. Again, I'm not, I don't do this podcast to create enemies, especially out of people who I consider to be friends. I just want you to consider, with lots of self-examination, how many that you could name that meet all these three criteria. Now, if you disagree with any of these criteria, that's cool. That's cool. But I want to give you these criteria for your consideration. Anyway, and, let's see where the chips fall. And I believe that as we look at this, we're going to say, yeah, I think it does make sense that a winsome creationist would need to be all three of these things, and yet many of them aren't. So let's look at this and see if this is something that we can work on together. All right, the first one, we've talked about a little bit already, being attractive, right? This idea that somebody would want to move towards you. Now, again, in conduct and in dialogue, the idea is that you want to be seen, in general, I would think, as being someone who handles things in a Christian way, all right? The problem with this terminology is that there are competing ideas of what that actually looks like. as funny as it sounds, right? In today's world, some people think it is Christian to show an outsized amount of love to certain uh, people groups or people who believe in certain ideologies, and yet we know that that's not the biblical view of that at all. And so I think the idea of attractive is just extremely objective, okay? In our world, nobody has to listen. Nobody has to listen. And so, you are literally just like one swipe on someone's phone. Somebody can just turn you off just like that. If you're in a conversation with somebody, they pick up their phone for 3 seconds, they're scrolling, they're out, they're gone. They're somewhere else. Nobody has to listen to you. So if you're not attractive, then no one is going to give you an audience. And what's really cool is that Jesus was an example of someone who was very incisive, but also he was attractive, right? He's our model. Jesus drew people into him, and yet he drew some pretty hard lines. He never backed down. He was strong, not passive. So to me, the idea of being winsome is not being passive, right? It's partly, at least, being attractive. It's being worth engaging with, to put it another way. By the time someone's finished talking with you, they need to feel either happier or more knowledgeable, maybe more comfortable as a result of listening to what you've had to say or spending some time with you. Are you someone who is attractive in that you are worth engaging with? That's going to be a big deal if our message is going to continue to have relevance. Because again, young age creationism, the historical view of the church, is dying. It's shrinking. The church is less young earth creationist, not more. So something that we have been doing isn't working. And I think that this podcast is really getting to the heart of that matter. So you got to be attractive if you're going to be winsome. The second thing you need to be is able. Able. You got to be prepared. And you got to be knowledgeable if you're going to have conversations about this topic with other people. And that's not to say that you have to be an expert in everything. In fact, I don't even recommend that you should. I'll give you my personal story and testimony on this and then explain how you can sort of apply it to you. You probably noticed, if you're a regular listener to this podcast, that I don't spend a lot of time talking about creation science proper. Sometimes we do, and usually when we have guests on. Why is that? Well, I'm not a scientist. I don't play one on TV, and I never claimed to be one. Now, I'm fascinated by it. I think science is very fascinating, but a lot of the actual science talk is me sort of just like shaking my head and being like, yeah, like this sounds really cool. Now, someone who is very knowledgeable in science may look at that and say, well, oh, you're just being terse then. You don't actually know the science behind all this. We do know the science on this, and you're wrong. Well, I mean, here's the way that I look at it, okay? Just because the scientists that I like to follow, scientists who do work in creation, are in the ideological minority, doesn't mean that I don't listen to the merits of what they say. Okay. I filter the noise that of the lack of winsomeness and charity that I often hear, and I listen for the details, and I read the stuff, and when people come up with counter arguments, I try to engage with that material as well, and I just try to have good conversations. And so, again, long ago, when I first started podcasting about creationism in 2017, I decided that I wasn't necessarily going to be the place where you came to learn lots of hard science. You would get some science out of me as I studied it and did the best I can. But what I was really just trying to do is popularize the work of scientific researchers who were more interested in a model building approach than in an evolution bashing approach, such that when we did talk about scientific things on the podcast, it would be done in a way where we were promoting the work of creationists who were building the creation model. And when I restarted my podcast, in 2022, December of 2022. So basically early 2023, let's call it that. It came off the heels of another Answers in Genesis visit to the Ark Encounter Creation Museum. By the way, love those places. Going back here in a month or so. Nothing against them. But, I noticed some of the issues again about the way that it's like, this information is so good if it was just communicated in a way that people could stand it. And so, I decided that when I relaunched my podcast that I would even make a further commitment to this idea of talking about the debate, about the nature of the origins debate, and also the biblical studies angle of it. Okay, so that's something where my interest differs from a lot of the other creation podcasts you're going to listen to. I'm way more interested in the theology and biblical studies and ancient Near Eastern thought on these topics. And again, you're going to see that, in a few, some discussions that are going to be coming up here on the channel. Way more interested in that side of it than I am the actual science. And so communication is really what I do in a nutshell for a living. And because I teach and preach in church, and then I do, of course, marketing and business communication in my professional life. So in all of those areas, I focus on communication. And so I figured, well, there's lots of people who talk about geology and, biology and paleontology, and I'll let them be who they are. As for me, I can make a contribution in mostly two areas. One is the art and science of communication, and the second is speaking to the biblical studies issues that come in and surround young age creationism. And so that's where I land on those two things. And what that means is I have decided that even though I can hang in a conversation with somebody where we might talk about a wide range of things, evolution or deep time related or whatever, and I read widely when I can in those subjects, I have a specialization. I want to make a measurable impact in the communication and the biblical studies angle, mostly the communication, but the communication and the biblical studies angle of creationism. I want to be a leading voice in those areas if I can. And so that's where my niche is. And I'll admit it's a smaller niche. You can see that I have a much smaller audience than many other people who talk about creation things, because we don't do, clickbait titles and have super sexy subject matter. And my education is not for the masses. It's for the already convinced creationist who wants to learn how to communicate about it better. And I realize that, and that's fine. I'm cool staying in my lane, and I will continue to create content that is for people who are in that same lane with me. Okay. So the point is that you should be able to have conversations in the subject matter. And my advice would be for you to pick a niche, specialize in a niche area where you feel like you can have a measurable impact. And go from there. Maybe for you, the niche area is paleontology. Maybe specifically it's human paleontology. Maybe for you, it's not. I mean, do your thing, man. Like that's it. That's your lane. You can make an impact for creationism in that lane. Do it. And so I think that's what everybody should strive to do, is be knowledgeable across the board where you can, but pick a niche area where you can be very, very knowledgeable and have really good arguments in there, and try to convince people who you feel like you can reach inside of that sphere. That's how I believe we have the most impact. And then third and finally, you need to be articulate. Like I said, I'm big on communication. So not only attractive, right? You want to be someone that people can move towards. Not only able, once they move toward you, you need to be able to hold a discussion with them in terms of being knowledgeable. But then also you need to be articulate, okay? Because if you're not articulate, then you don't have a convincing way of expressing your views to help move people and change their minds, okay? So clear and convincing communication is the goal when it comes to being articulate. And frankly, and this might be, a little unexpected, but part of being articulate is not just what you say. It's how you act in that, hey, are you a good listener? Are you able to listen to someone's view and not only articulate their view back to them, but do it in such a way that you can expose the flaws in their thinking and help them potentially see a new way of looking at the issue. there was some criticism, and I plan to address this more directly, but there was some criticism in my episode on the Columbo tactic, where despite me literally saying this, in the episode and talking around this, the idea is not to manipulate. And there were some people thinking, oh, all you guys want to do is manipulate other people. You'd never want to study the issues for yourself, or you want other people to change their minds, but you're never willing to change your mind. Well, again, there's a lot that I could say to a person like that. One thing that comes up to mind, and we're actually going to discuss this thoroughly in the book, is this idea that you have to pick a philosophy, right? Like, science is built upon the framework of a philosophy, right? And so if you take a biblical philosophy of science, then you're going to actually land somewhere different than if you say take a naturalistic view to science. And most people who take the scientific view think there's no room to take the biblical view. And I try to show in the book that is possible to do. That you have to start from a base framework, okay? And there are some things that you're going to have to take for granted, no matter which view that you take, that will inform a lot of how you interpret evidence. And so the idea with being articulate is actually being able to not only share and communicate your own views in a clear and convincing way, but listen to other people well. Try to understand what they're saying in a way where not only do you hear them, but you might even understand their view and the implications of it better than them. Repeat it back to them and help them to expose flaws in their thinking. Now, of course, if all of this is the case, then you are also going to have to be willing to change your mind, okay, when things don't work out. By the way, you're not always right about everything. Now you may say, "Now, hey, Steve, okay, cool, but where are some issues where you've changed your mind on within young age creationism?" I'll give you one. I've talked about it before on the podcast, but perhaps you're looking right now for something to say, "Hey, you know what? I bet you've never changed your mind on an issue in creationism." That's not true. I have. But I think is actually a pretty big issue, by the way, and that is on this issue of concordism. Most young age creationists are concordists in that they believe that the statements of Scripture are going to, in some way, one-on-one map to science. Okay. Now, the easiest way to understand this is the the old age creationist, who says that Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, is basically mappable to the Big Bang. Okay. That's an example of concordism. Now, I used to be a concordist in that I thought the biblical statements mapped to one-on-one descriptions of the way things took place in actual reality. I've changed my mind on that view. I'm no longer a concordist. I am a non-concordist. And I've, again, came to this position through, much study, much prayer, much interacting with lots of different people, much trying to wade through the term, because I don't even think the term is very helpful. It's a little bit confusing. And but I've talked about it before. And again, the idea of concordism is something that a lot of creationists would get hung up on. And eventually the data just became clear to me that, being a concordist is not something that I'm committed to as a young age creationist. And in fact, there are some problems that are quite difficult for young age creationists to grapple with if you're going to be a concordist. And I talk about a few of those different examples in the book. Another thing, when I was a creationist, when I first got into young earth creationism and I was following, all the people, I was pretty well convinced that Leviathan and Behemoth and these kind of things were dinosaurs, right? You can see them in the book of Job. Leviathan shows up in Psalms. I was pretty convinced that they were dinosaurs. Today, I'm aware of many different views on that subject, and since I'm no longer a concordist, I don't need these things to map to some one-on-one description of a real creature in reality. I think the evidence could point that way, but I'm also open to other views, like that these guys were actually just ancient Near Eastern chaos monsters, and that the people living in that time would be familiar with and would be part of their, let's call it, lore, or their worldview thinking. And I don't think that thinking that damages young earth creationism at all. And my view that I take in the book is that young earth creationism, TM, official big YEC, would actually take it as quite an affront that if it turned out that those animals were not, say, dinosaurs, because they seem to be the most accurate. That seems to be the most accurate in their view description of these things. And I know that if pressed, any individual young earth creationist may back off on that view a little bit, but I think it's fair to say that if you look at the, overall tent of young earth creationism, most people there are going to be pretty offended if you take a view that Behemoth and Leviathan et al. Are not dinosaurs. And I think they could be dinosaurs. But also, there's some pretty good arguments in the literature saying that, well, maybe they're not. So, and that goes back to my episode on mere young age creationism, which again, some people weren't very happy with the language that I used there and the way that I framed it out. And there were some people who said, well, I would include this or I wouldn't include this. And that's totally fine. I'm not saying that I'm the end all be all here. But what I am trying to do is show that even as a creationist, there is room for us to change our minds. And we must do this because, to the point of the commenters, if you only want other people to change their mind, but you're never willing to change your mind, then what are we doing here? And now you may want to take this one step even further and say, well, but surely there's some things you're not willing to change your mind about. And this is where I say, well, no, that's really not the case. It's just that I've studied the evidence. And it'd be like talking in broader worldview categories and saying, well, Christianity versus Islam or something like that. Well, you have to be willing to change your mind about Jesus. And here's the thing about it, though, is the evidence is in, and I've looked at it. And in that case, let's just be very particular. In that case, Islam does not have the goods, and Christianity does have the goods. It has the strategic upper hand. And so it's not that I'm unwilling to change my mind. It's that the evidence is in, and there's millennia of evidence, and it doesn't look like things are going to change. And that's how I feel with respect to the biblical data. Now, there's some others who might want to change my mind on this, but as far as I can see in the biblical data, the reasons are pretty sound to be a young age creationist. Now, again, there might be one point here or there that changes over time, but I think the general sense that God created in 6 days, roughly 6,000 years ago, has been time tested by theologians the world over, and I'm just not convinced that the argument for an old age for the earth is there. And so it's not that I'm unwilling to change my mind on it, but the evidence would have to be, of a nature that was so overwhelming. It would take some brand new discovery. I'll give you one. If you had some serious evidence, this is a little bit of a rabbit trail, but it's my podcast, so here we go. If you had some serious evidence that there was a specific number cipher that the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11 mapped to from, say, a neighbor of Israel, that there was other biblical data around, and that there was a very clear one-to-one correlation where you could tell from what was going on in the genealogies themselves, you could tell what was going on, that a very specific purpose was being accomplished. And it looks like that the ages of the patriarchs and the length of the genealogies might not be real and might not be roughly what it is. That would be the first thing to come along in a long time that would make me take a bigger step back and say, maybe the Bible doesn't affirm something like young age creationism. Because as of right now, the counter case to that is that there are only two places in world history, especially if you take a biblical view, there are only two places in world history where we have a time gap that is not established by some other important metric. And that's the genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11, which also, by the way, contain chronological information, unlike any other genealogy also in world history. And so it sure looks like the purpose of those genealogies is to create an unbroken line, not only from Adam to Jesus, but also to bridge time gaps in history where we would need them to be bridged in order to come up with a rough date for the age of the earth. To me, the evidence is way more on that side. The evidence, against that is very, very vague. I mean, even William Lane Craig, writing in his Historical Adam book, was able to point to like Sumerian king lists as, which, I mean, the ages there are just so far off, way different from what you have in the biblical account. So that's my problem, is the examples are just so vague and so far off from what we actually find in the Bible that I just don't think that's a credible objection. Okay? So that would be the one thing, because as I've argued with my friend Mark before, we've done a podcast episode on this, I think actually you could even do without Genesis 1 and still come up with young age creationism. I think if you put a serious dent in those genealogies, then that would give me cause for pause. I'm not saying that would make me totally change my mind on the issue, but that would make me do some serious reevaluation. And so that's the kind of thing. That's what I'm saying. The point is not whether or not you've changed your mind. The point is, where are you demonstrating some openness? Where are you drawing your lines? Okay. And again, we don't want to be the people who accept blindly one view that we like in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And we want to be able to understand everybody else's position to the best we can as well. So I've rambled a lot, and pretty much we're here at the end. So the recommendations that I'd love to leave you with are two things. One, and you can disagree with various aspects of what these people, do and say. The first book I'm going to recommend is Greg Koukl's Tactics, okay? And I'm going to disagree with him on the issue of the age of the earth. He's an old age creationist. I disagree with him, but his book Tactics is fantastic on helping to maneuver in conversation. And Dr. Jason Lisle. Love and appreciate the ministry of Dr. Jason Lisle. I wouldn't quite use some of the wording that he uses in some of his communications, and so I had my disagreements with him. But his book called Discerning Truth, I think, is a fantastic look at the ways that particularly evolutionists tend to use logical fallacies when making their arguments for their view and against our view. Okay, so Greg Koukl's Tactics and Jason Lisle's Discerning Truth are both great books that will help you from the articulation end of being able to point out and to spot flaws in the way that other people are speaking and arguing. But you have to be articulate. You have to be kind. You have to be winsome and attractive. And I hope that my podcast and my book coming out and resources that I create in the future will be a step in the right direction of helping you to take that full package together and communicate well as a young age creationist. So thank you so much for spending some time with me on this episode. I dearly and humbly appreciate you and the time that you spend. And we'll catch you next time on the Winsome Creationist. Bye-bye.